The town of Vidernahora had once smelled of wood smoke and rye bread, of river clay and the particular earthen sweetness that clings to places where people have lived for generations without interruption. It had been a modest place, the kind of town that appeared on older maps as a dot with a name beside it and disappeared from newer ones without ceremony, absorbed by the countryside, forgotten by cartographers who had more important borders to worry about. Its cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of boots and cartwheels and the slow erosion of mountain weather. Its church had a bell tower that leaned slightly eastward, as though straining to hear something in the distance. Its houses were built close together against the cold, their walls whitewashed in summer and gray by winter, their window boxes still holding the brittle skeletons of last season's flowers. Now the town smelled of copper. The wind moved through it differently than it had before. Wind through a living town carries sound with it. Voices through open windows, the scrape of a chair, the whine of a hinge, a child calling out from somewhere around a corner. Wind through a dead town carries only itself. It moved through Vidernahora now with a strange efficiency, finding no resistance, slipping through doorways that stood open and unchallenged, riffling through papers that had blown off tables and come to rest against the base of the stone well in the central square. The well's rope still swayed. No one had secured it. No one remained who might think to do so. The first house at the edge of the road had its door hanging from a single hinge, turned at an angle that let the wind push it slowly inward and slowly back, inward and back. The rhythm of it was almost hypnotic in the silence. Inside, a table had been overturned. Not in a struggle, or not entirely in one. There was a quality to the wreckage that suggested something had passed through without particular interest in what it disturbed, the way a river current disturbs the silt at the bottom, not out of intention, but simply because it has mass and direction. A bowl lay in pieces near the cold hearth. A candle had burned down to a flattened puddle of wax on the floor. Whatever the occupants had been doing when the evening changed, they had not had time to finish it. There were two of them. They were in the corner of the room, arranged against the wall with a specificity that no accident could explain. Their arms had been placed across their chests. Their eyes were closed. Someone had taken the time to make them look peaceful, or something approximating it, and this careful arrangement of the dead was more disturbing than any scene of violence could have been, because it spoke of deliberateness, of an intelligence that had committed the act and then paused to consider the aesthetics of it. Whatever had done this had not been in a frenzy. Whatever had done this had thought about how it looked. The bloodstains on the wall behind them formed a pattern that might have been arbitrary, but did not feel it. Further along the road, more doors, more stillness. The wind continued its indifferent circulation. A dog lay near the mouth of an alley between the bakers and the cobblers, and unlike the humans, it had not been arranged. It lay as it had fallen, on its side, legs extended, in the posture of an animal that had been running and then simply ceased. Whatever it had been running toward or away from, it had not reached. The cobblestones beneath it were dark. A cat sat on the ledge above the alley entrance and watched the street below with the focused intensity that cats bring to anything they observe, though there was nothing left to observe, nothing moving, nothing to merit attention. The cat did not seem to know this yet. It waited with great patience for the town to resume. The church at the center had its doors closed, which was unusual given the uniformity of open and broken doors elsewhere. Someone had closed them deliberately from the inside, and the bar across them had been dropped into its iron brackets with force enough to leave an impression in the old wood. Whatever was inside had either barricaded itself in or had entered through another means and secured the door afterward as a matter of habit or preference. The leaning bell tower cast a shadow across the square that the moon elongated into something thin and irregular. The bell itself had not rung. This was notable. In every town, in every incident that had preceded this one by months and years across the dark corridors of this region, the bell had rung at some point in the proceedings, pulled by desperate hands, a last call for help, an announcement of catastrophe to whatever might lie beyond the hills. The bell here had remained silent. No one had reached it in time. or something had prevented them. The stone well stood at the center of the square, and around its base the flagstones had been disturbed, not broken, but marked, as though something had moved around it in a circle, pacing or circling, and the solace of whatever moved had left impressions in the old moss that grew between the stones. The circle was complete. Whatever had paced the entire circumference and returned to its starting point, and from that starting point a single trail of marks led toward the eastern edge of the square, toward the road that wound upward through the pines toward the ridge. And then the marks stopped, as marks made by whatever manner of creature did not need the ground to support its weight will stop cleanly, decisively, at the point where the road left the cobblestones and became packed earth. The night was perhaps 2 hours from dawn. The moon was high and very bright. He was standing at the tree line. He had been there for some time before anything in the scene below had changed enough to confirm what he already knew from the smell of the place, from the absolute quality of its silence, from the particular way the wildlife had evacuated the surrounding forest in a radius that corresponded with a specific geometry of terror. Small animals knew. They had always known, even before they evolved into their current forms. Something in the architecture of their nervous systems recognized the predator that had no natural equivalent, that occupied no niche in the ordinary ecology of fear. They fled it not by category but by instinct, so old it had no name. The forest around the town was empty of birds. Not sleeping, empty. They had gone before dark. That told him something about the age of what had happened here, and about the lingering quality of the thing that had done it. He watched the town the way old things watch, without urgency, without the restless scanning of eyes that require novelty to confirm they are paying attention. He watched it with the settled, comprehensive stillness of something that has learned to see everything at once by committing to a fixed point and letting the periphery inform the center. His breathing was so slow it was nearly indistinguishable from no breathing at all. The cold air that moved past the tree line stirred the hem of his coat and moved through his hair and carried to him, with perfect fidelity, everything the town still contained. The smell of copper was the dominant note. It always was. Beneath it were the other things, the disturbed earth, the extinguished fires, the specific chemical signature of abandoned food, of candles snuffed out mid-burn, of laundry left wet on the line to stiffen in the night air because no one had come back to bring it in. And beneath all of that, faint but distinct, the scent he had followed for 11 days across mountain passes and river valleys, and the muddy remnants of an old road that most current maps did not show. It was the smell of very old blood, of blood that had been consumed and processed by something that had been consuming blood for a long time, altering it through some mechanism that no physician had ever studied and no natural science had ever successfully categorized. It was the smell of what he was, turned outward. A mirror's scent. He descended from the tree line without sound. His boots found the packed earth road and moved along it without disturbing the surface in any way that would leave an impression. This was not an effort, it was what he was, what centuries of existence had refined him into, something that left increasingly few marks on the world it passed through. He moved through the square and read it the way he had learned to read such places, the vocabulary of catastrophe, the grammar of predation. The arrangements in the corner house confirmed something he had been considering since the third incident, 4 valleys back. The circle of marks around the well confirmed something else. The condition of the closed church doors confirmed a third thing, and it was the third thing that he stood with for a long moment before moving on. He had hunted more than 60 of them across the centuries. He knew their variations, their pathologies, their particular flavors of monstrosity. Some were feral, hunger-given locomotion, creatures so far gone from whatever they had once been that calling them by human pronouns felt like a category error. They were terrible in their simplicity, driven by thirst and darkness, predictable in their range and their cycle, devastating but containable in their own way once you understood the shape of their desperation. Some were methodical cold in the way that long life and complete isolation produce coldness, having moved so far beyond human concerns that the humans they preyed on registered as something slightly less than fully real to them, a resource, a necessity, managed with an efficiency that felt more administrative than malevolent. This one was neither of those things. He had known this since the first signs of it, since the found bodies of Morsback and the thing at the edge of the road in Shilvasvarad, since the patterns that kept recurring across what should have been completely unrelated incidents separated by geography and time. This one enjoyed itself. Not in the way that base creatures take pleasure in feeding. That was biological, reflexive, as morally inert as any animal satisfaction at catching prey. This was different. This one staged things. This one considered its work. This one returned to the places it had destroyed, sometimes, and stood in them. And something about the returning seemed to be part of the act rather than a precaution or a vulnerability. He had found the impressions of standing figures in the ash and debris of prior scenes, the kind of impressions made by something standing still for a long time, facing inward toward the devastation, rather than outward toward escape. The posture of contemplation, the posture of satisfaction. The church doors bothered him most. He stood before them now and touched the wood with his fingers, reading the grain of it, the age of it, the quality of the impact that had driven the bar down. It had not been driven down by human hands. The wood had compressed in a way that human strength at its most extreme could not account for. He turned from the doors and looked back across the square, across the rope still swaying at the well, across the flagstones with their disturbed moss and their completed circle, across the dark mouths of the houses with their open and broken doors. The thing had circled the well and then left. It had not lingered here the way it had lingered in other places. Something had interrupted the established pattern, or something had changed within the established pattern. An evolution in methodology, a shift in intention. He read the square one more time and found what he had missed on first examination. At the base of the well, worked into the disturbed moss with a deliberateness that left no room for coincidence, there was a shape, not a letter, not a symbol from any tradition he recognized by category, though something in him recognized it in a deeper way, as a shape that existed below language, before language, in that layer of meaning that predates the codification of human symbolic thought. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the road leading east toward the ridge. He already knew where it was going. He had known since before this town, since he had stood in the woods above Shilvasvarad and felt something shift in the architecture of the hunt, felt the particular vertigo that comes from recognizing something of yourself in the thing you are pursuing. He had dismissed it then as the product of long isolation acting on an old mind, the brain manufacturing connection from pattern, the psyche inserting narrative into what was purely operational. He had dismissed it and continued east, and the east had brought him here, and here had brought him this shape in the moss at the base of the well, and he could no longer dismiss it, because dismissing it would require a capacity for self-deception that he had burned out of himself centuries ago, in a process that had left marks as permanent and unhealable as anything else in his long existence. He straightened. He looked at the eastern road. He looked at the shape in the moss one final time. Then he walked east. There was a particular quality to solitude that ordinary human experience did not prepare one for, a quality only accessible through duration, not the solitude of an afternoon or a week or even a year, but the solitude that accumulates across decades and centuries and becomes something structural, something that is no longer the absence of company, but the presence of its own internal landscape. He had read in the early years everything he could find that addressed it, the Desert Fathers with their holy isolation, the accounts of hermits and anchorites, the philosophical treatments of aloneness from traditions across the continent, even the practical literature of explorers and castaways. None of it was adequate. They all addressed solitude as a condition to be endured or transcended, or made meaningful through spiritual framework. None of them addressed what happened when solitude became simply the natural state of a thing, when it ceased to be a condition and became a substrate, the ground on which everything else stood. He had not chosen this, or he had chosen it in the way that someone falling chooses the direction they fall, in the sense that they cannot choose otherwise, in the sense that the forces acting on them make a particular outcome inevitable without requiring any act of will. After the village, after the thing that he still could not name without the naming of it, opening something structural in him that he preferred to keep sealed, he had understood with a clarity that required no deliberation that to be near people was to endanger them. Not in the abstract way, not in the philosophical way, but in the immediate, concrete, next morning way. He was what he was. He had proven what he was capable of. The evidence was not equivocal. He had removed himself. The removal had been gradual at first. He had stayed at the edges of things, the edge of forests, the edge of towns, the margins of mapped territory where civilization thinned out and became suggestions rather than facts. He had watched from distances that kept him safe and kept others safe, and the watching had become something he was very good at, something he developed into a practice with the rigor of a scholar developing a discipline, systematic, observational, cumulative. He had watched human civilization from its edges across centuries, and he had recorded it in a way, not on paper, but in the accumulating tissue of his memory, which retained everything with a fidelity that was not comfort but weight. He remembered things that no living human could verify. He remembered the texture of a world that the history books described only in outline. He did not think of it as loss anymore. In the early centuries he had, in the long dark interior years when the grief of separation had enough freshness to register as active pain rather than as the dull structural ache it eventually became. He had mourned extravagantly and privately, with no witness and no ritual and no community of loss to make the mourning coherent. He had mourned his humanity in the only way available to him, which was alone and without ceremony, in the dark spaces between human settlements, in the long empty hours between hunting and the next hunting. Eventually the mourning had become something else, something harder and more useful, and he had allowed that transformation because it was the only transformation available to him, and because the thing that remained after the mourning was the instrument he needed. He was old enough now that he did not keep precise count of years. This was not forgetfulness. His memory remained comprehensive, detailed, inescapably complete. It was more that at a certain point the counting became an exercise that no longer revealed anything useful. The way a very large number ceases to convey a meaningful quantity and becomes purely abstract. He knew that he had existed before certain events and after others, that he had been present in certain centuries and not others, that the world had changed around him in ways that he could trace with considerable precision, and that the tracing of did not comfort or orient him. He simply was old. There were very few things that surprised him at this point in his existence, and the things that did surprise him were notable precisely because they were so rare. The thing he was hunting now had surprised him. His senses, after centuries, had achieved a level of refinement that was difficult to describe in terms that ordinary perception could encompass. He smelled things across distances that would be meaningless to communicate. He heard the difference between similar silences. He tasted the quality of darkness in the air and extracted from it information about what had moved through that air before him, hours or days prior, with a degree of specificity that went well beyond what any single sense should have been capable of. But the senses did not operate individually for him anymore, had not for a very long time. They operated as a unified system, a continuous reading of the environment that was more comprehensive than vision and more precise than analysis, something that he had come to think of simply as knowing, the way other beings use knowing to describe the synthesis of available information into a working model of reality. He tracked by scent, primarily, but the scent was only the most legible layer. The disruption of wildlife patterns in a region was as informative as any physical sign. Animals did not simply flee a predator. They fled it in patterns specific to the predator's qualities, and the patterns around vampire-affected areas had a consistent signature that he had spent years learning to distinguish from the patterns associated with floods, fires, disease outbreaks, the encroachment of wolves, the invisible movements of geological stress. The predator he sought left an ecological signature that extended well beyond the radius of any individual attack. Birds stopped calling in a graduated withdrawal from the affected center, the radius corresponding to the age and hunger intensity of the creature. Ground animals burrowed deeper and stayed underground longer than their natural cycles required. Even insects were affected in ways that he had never fully understood but had learned to read. The quality of insect sound in an area near where something of this kind had recently been active changed in a manner difficult to specify, but consistently identifiable once you had developed the reference. He tracked by disruptions in the built environment too. Human settlements had rhythms, and violations of those rhythms were visible to someone who had watched settlements long enough to internalize their normal patterns. Smoke from chimneys at irregular hours, doors open past nightfall, missing cattle that were not explained by predator tracks, children who stopped appearing in village squares on market days. He had learned to read these signs from distances and intervals. That meant he was generally aware of trouble well before it reached its catastrophic phase, but not always. Not in places like Viturna, where the creature had moved faster than any of its predecessors, with a decisive efficiency that spoke of either increasing confidence or increasing appetite. Or both. He did not eat. Not the way he had once eaten. Not the way any living thing eats by natural right, taking nourishment from the available forms of it. He had not fed on a human being for longer than he could hold in an easy accounting, centuries, in any case. The hunger had never gone away. He had been very clear about this in his own internal accounting of things, had never allowed himself the comfort of believing he had conquered it, or transcended it, or that the discipline of not feeding had somehow reduced the underlying drive. The hunger was constant. It was the most consistent thing in his existence, more consistent than his sense of self, more consistent than his purposes, more consistent than his memories of what he had been before the thing that changed him. The hunger was simply there, with the immovable factual presence of a permanent geological feature, and he lived alongside it the way things live alongside geography, by learning its exact contours and navigating around them, rather than by pretending they were not there. He fed on vampires. He had arrived at this through a logic that was not comfortable, but was coherent. He had needed to feed. The hunger, denied long enough, did not simply intensify, it altered. It became something that threatened the margins of control, and he had discovered, in a period of particular desperation many centuries back, that the blood of the already dead did not carry with it the same consequences as the blood of the living. Not in the physical sense. The nutrition of it was different, requiring more of it, less efficient, less sustaining per quantity consumed, but in the moral calculus that he had built for himself with great deliberateness over the long centuries of his existence, that calculus that was the only ordering principle he had remaining. He did not take human lives to feed. He took the lives of things that were already removing human lives. The arithmetic of it, worked out in the long mathematical process of his internal accounting, came out differently than ordinary predation. He was not sure he believed it entirely. He had never been sure. The uncertainty was part of the structure of the thing, built into it from its inception, because certainty would have been a form of absolution. And he had decided very early and very firmly that absolution was not available to him, that what he had done in the beginning was not a thing that could be balanced by subsequent acts, that the dead of the village he had destroyed had not agreed to be balanced against anything. He hunted and he killed and he fed and he continued, and whether this was redemption or something else was a question he held open, deliberately, permanently open. Because closing it would have been the same as lying to himself, and he had given up the capacity for self-deception as a survival measure in the early centuries when he had discovered how dangerous it was. He was not a heroic figure, and he had never constructed himself as one. He recognized the temptation. He recognized how easy it would have been to build a narrative in which his hunting of other vampires was a service to humanity. a penance that accumulated toward some ultimate settlement, a story with a redemptive arc that resolved in his eventual absolution. It was a very appealing narrative. It was available to him at every moment, and at every moment he declined it, because the test he applied to it was simple. Would the people in the village he had destroyed, if they could be consulted, agree that the subsequent centuries of his hunting had balanced their deaths? He knew what they would say. He had always known what they would say. They would say no. Not because they were cruel or unreasonable, but because the logic of it simply did not hold. Their deaths had not been a debt to be repaid, but an act of destruction that could not be undone. And acts that cannot be undone cannot be balanced by subsequent acts, only accompanied by them. He continued because stopping would have been worse. He continued because the alternative, simply existing without purpose, feeding on whatever was available without discrimination, gradually withdrawing further from any engagement with the world, felt like a greater dishonor to what had been lost than continuing did. He continued because the things he hunted were real threats to real people who were alive now and had not yet been damaged, and preventing the damage had value even if it could not balance prior damage. He continued because there was nothing else to be. He was very old and very refined and very purposeful, and the purpose was terrible and necessary and not heroic, and that was what he was. He moved east through the dark. The rain had been following him for 4 days. Not following in any supernatural sense. He was not susceptible to that kind of thinking. Had not been for a long time, but following in the meteorological sense of a weather system moving roughly eastward through the mountain region at approximately the same pace as his own movement, so that he traveled in its forward edge, in the cold, damp margin between the dry air behind and the heavy rain ahead, which was in some ways the most unpleasant portion of any storm to travel in. The rain, when it came, was at least consistent. The margin was unsettled, undecided, flickering between states, the temperature dropping and rising by small degrees, the air smelling alternately of iron and ozone, the wind changing direction, without pattern or logic. He had followed the trail through 3 countries, across a span of geography that would have required weeks of ordinary human travel even now, in an era when roads had improved considerably from the rutted tracks of earlier centuries. He had covered it in 11 days of sustained movement, stopping only when he needed to stop, which was rarely. He did not require sleep in the way living things require it. He rested occasionally in the way that very old machinery rests when cooled, not from necessity but from the value of allowing systems to settle, to reduce to baseline, to achieve a clarity that sustained operation gradually obscures. He had rested twice since the trail began, in deep interior spaces where the rock insulated him from the particular quality of sunlight that was genuinely dangerous, and the other quality that was merely uncomfortable. He had used these rests to review what he knew and organize it into a shape that could support the next phase of the hunt. What he knew was considerable and disturbing. The creature he was tracking was not recent. That was the first thing and the most important. The most recently created vampires were almost always the most dangerous, hunger uncontrolled, discipline non-existent, no knowledge of what they were or how to manage it, all of them burning through their early years in a frenzy of feeding that was catastrophically visible and ultimately self-limiting because it consumed the local food supply and triggered the kind of human response that even very powerful creatures could not indefinitely survive. The frenzy was terrible, and it was predictable, and it burned itself out or was extinguished by circumstances or, occasionally, by him. The recently made were the most visible because they were the most indiscriminate. This creature was not indiscriminate. It had been moving carefully across the region for a period that he estimated at between 20 and 40 years, which placed its creation, if it had been created and was not simply one of the rare wild emergences, which he had encountered twice in all his centuries, somewhere between the middle and the end of the previous century. Old enough to have developed control. Old enough to have developed method. Not old enough to have developed the kind of philosophical patience that very long existence eventually forced, but old enough to know what it was doing and to have decided to do it in a particular way. The method was what distinguished it. He had spent the 4 days in the rain's margin reviewing the method, cross-referencing it against the documented incidents from the various locations he had moved through, extracting from the aggregate what individual incidents obscured. There were patterns in the patterns, organizing principles beneath the apparent surface randomness, and when he found them, they were not reassuring. The creature chose isolated communities. Not remote, isolated was a different quality. Remote communities were simply far from centers of power and population. Isolated communities were ones that had been cut off in some way from the networks of support and communication that would otherwise make their sudden disappearance immediately apparent. Communities experiencing bad harvests and subsequent emigration, so that a reduced population could be explained by ordinary attrition. Communities in the early stages of epidemic, where deaths were already accumulating and an additional surge would be attributed to the progression of disease. Communities at the intersection of political tensions, where the abrupt silence of the settlement might be read as the aftermath of conventional violence. The creature was selecting for communities whose disappearances would be absorbed into existing explanatory frameworks without triggering the kind of investigation that might eventually lead somewhere inconvenient. This was intelligent. This was deliberate. This was the kind of thinking that required not just intelligence, but historical knowledge and understanding of how human societies managed the interpretation of catastrophe, what explanations they reached for and when, what thresholds triggered different levels of response. To have this knowledge, the creature had to have been observing human society carefully for a long time. It was not simply surviving in proximity to human settlement. It was studying it. And the study had produced a method of operation that was more sophisticated than anything he had encountered in any of the 60-odd instances of his prior hunting. The arrangement of bodies was the second element that had distinguished itself from the aggregate. Most creatures that fed with any regularity left bodies where they fell or moved them purely for practical reasons. Concealment, distance from the feeding site, simple continuation of motion. Arrangement was rare. He had seen it perhaps 4 or 5 times across all his centuries, and in each prior case, it had been a specific and limited behavior associated with specific pathological formations that he had come to understand over time as responses to particular kinds of original trauma. The arrangement impulse emerged in his observation from a specific type of consciousness, one that had not entirely lost the human framework of meaning-making, that was still engaged with symbolic action, that still required the world to have a legible shape. The arrangements in these incidents were more elaborate than anything he had previously seen. They were not random arrangements into aesthetically pleasing or concealing configurations. They followed a logic that he was only beginning to map, a spatial and positional grammar that repeated with variations across the different incident sites, modified by the specific architecture of each location, but consistent in its underlying structure. He had sketched this grammar in his memory with the rigor of an archivist, cross-referencing each instance, and what emerged from the cross-referencing was not comfortable. The arrangements were memorial in structure. Not in the mourning sense. He did not believe the creature mourned its victims, but in the sense of commemoration. They had the quality of marking, of insisting on the reality and significance of something that might otherwise be overlooked. The victims were placed in configurations that recalled, though abstractly, the configurations of figures in certain types of religious or ceremonial iconography, the kind that depicted the arrangement of survivors around a moment of foundational violence, a foundational loss, a rupture in the order of things that was being preserved in image so that it could not be forgotten. The message was not for the dead. It was not for any human who might find the scene. He was no longer sure the message was meant for him, though he had originally assumed it was. He was beginning to think the message was for the creature itself. That was the unsettling thought he kept circling back to, the thought that had invaded the careful operational framework of the hunt and refused to be. dislodged by reason or discipline, or the simple application of focus to what was immediately in front of him. The creature was commemorating something. The creature had experienced a foundational rupture, a moment of originary violence that it was not able to leave behind, that it was, in fact, insisting on the continuance of its reality, insisting on being seen and remembered. The body arrangements were not trophies, they were witnesses. The creature was creating witnesses to something it could not otherwise testify to. He had done this himself once, not with bodies, with words, with the accumulation of memory, with the obsessive internal cataloging of every detail of every face from the village, the names and the circumstances and the particular quality of the last moments before what he had done to them. He had created witnesses in the only architecture available to him, the inescapable complete memory of an ancient mind, and the witnessing had been and remained a form of ongoing violence against himself, a refusal to allow forgiveness in any form. He understood what the creature was doing. He understood it in the deepest possible way. The understanding made the hair at the back of his neck rise, which was remarkable, because nothing had made the hair at the back of his neck rise in a very long time. He crested the ridge above the tree line on the 11th evening and stood in the cold air above the clouds and looked east. The landscape below him was completely dark, no settlements visible, no light of any kind except the distant cold burn of stars and the moon beginning to rise behind the far peaks. He could feel the trail below the clouds, could feel it with the comprehensive knowing that was his primary sense, could feel the direction and the distance, and most crucially, the quality of the thing he was following, the specific signature of age and state and internal condition that told him things about it that it could not have known it was broadcasting. It was not far ahead now, perhaps 2 days at most, and it was waiting for him. He had not been certain of this until this moment, but now, standing above the clouds on the cold ridge, he was certain. The pace of the incidents, which had been accelerating, had not accelerated since Vidurnahora. It had stopped. The creature had done something in Vidurnahora, and then stopped and settled somewhere to the east. And whatever it was doing there, it was not moving. It was not hiding. A creature hiding would move laterally, would complicate its trail, would use the techniques that his prior targets had occasionally used, doubling back, crossing water, embedding in settlements in ways that made the trail's end indistinguishable from the living signatures around it. This creature had simply stopped and was remaining in a fixed location, which was either extreme confidence or an invitation. He did not know yet which one it was. He thought about it for a long time on the ridge, in the cold wind, with the stars burning their ancient unreachable light and the moon rising and the clouds below him, moving eastward in the same direction he would need to go. Then he descended and moved east, and did not permit himself to think about the shape in the moss at the base of the well again, because that line of thinking led somewhere he was not yet ready to go, and he needed to be operational, and operational required a particular kind of discipline that nostalgia and guilt and the vertigo of self-recognition were not compatible with. He was almost successful. It had been a winter, the winter of the village. He remembered the season with a precision that extended beyond meteorological data, the particular quality of the cold, the specific angle of the light in the short afternoons, the way the frozen ground sounded different from the frozen ground of other winters, a denser, more definitive silence underfoot. He had been young by the standards he now applied to himself, young in the way that all new things are young, without perspective, without the mechanisms that long experience constructs against the overwhelming immediacy of sensation and need. He had been changed for less than 3 years. He had not yet understood what he was. He did not revisit this period of his existence voluntarily. He did not approach it as something to be examined or processed or understood. He had done all of that, systematically, in the centuries immediately following, with a thoroughness that had left nothing unexamined. The examination had not helped. The full and complete understanding of exactly what had happened and exactly why and exactly what the internal experience of it had been, had not produced resolution or integration or any of the other things that human frameworks for processing trauma suggested it should produce. It had produced instead a complete and permanent record of something that should not have happened, and that the completeness of the record could not undo. The village had been called something. He remembered the name. He did not use it, even internally, the way one does not speak the true names of things whose invocation costs something that cannot be recovered. He had been moving through the region in the grip of a hunger that was 3 weeks old. He had been trying to sustain himself on animal blood, which was possible in the way that certain diets are possible for human bodies, survivable, nourishing to an extent, but not adequate to the fundamental need, not meeting the specific biochemical requirement that his changed nature had imposed on him, with the absolute non-negotiability of breathing. The animal blood blunted the edge of the hunger without resolving it, and the unresolved hunger had been building across those 3 weeks into something that he could feel moving in him like a tide, pulling against the margins of his control with a steady, patient, inexorable force. He had been aware of this. He had known what it meant. He had chosen, with the limited and inexperienced understanding available to him at that point, to move through the region rather than away from it, because moving away would have required him to understand the geography of safe distances, and he had not understood it yet. He had not understood very much yet. The village had been there. It had been there as all villages were there in winter, enclosed, contracted, turned inward, the smoke rising from the chimneys and the light from the windows warm yellow against the early dark. He had not intended to stop. He had intended to pass through the edges of it, the way he had passed through the edges of other settlements, skirting them, using the darkness at their margins, taking nothing from them. He had been, in those early years, still deeply and painfully concerned with his own intentions. He had placed a great deal of weight on intentions. He had not yet learned that the weight of intention against sufficient hunger is nothing. Something had happened at the edge of the village. He did not organize it as an event, even now, could not give it narrative structure, because it had not had narrative structure. It had been the sudden collapse of a margin that had been thinning for 3 weeks, the final breach of a boundary that he had been approaching without fully accounting for the approach. A smell. The specific, overwhelming smell of warmth and life and blood in the cold air, all of it amplified beyond anything he had previously experienced, because he had been denying himself that smell, had been actively avoiding it, and now it was everywhere, coming from every direction, surrounding him with the completeness of something that cannot be outrun. After that, he did not have a clear account. He had memory, perfect, inescapable, detailed, but the memory was not an account in the sense of a narrative with causation and sequence. It was a collection of images, of sensory impressions, of sounds that he still heard with the original fidelity, with no mitigation from time, because his memory did not have the merciful blurring mechanism that human memory uses to protect the person who owns it. The faces, the sounds, the cold air becoming warm and then very warm, the snow, the quality of the silence that came after, the color of things in the moonlight. He never permitted himself to describe it in more detail than that, even internally, because the full description was available, but the full description served no purpose. He knew what had happened. He would always know what had happened. He did not need to walk through it in order to maintain his relationship to it, which was one of permanent, complete, irreversible responsibility. The responsibility was the thing he had salvaged from it, the only thing. Not understanding, not forgiveness, not the capacity to contextualize it within the framework of what he was, or what he had been, or how he had come to be. Just the responsibility, held intact, protected against the erosive action of time and distance and self-justification, kept in exactly the form it had assumed in the morning light of the day after, when he had stood in the village and understood what the silence meant. He had been, in the morning light, capable of understanding what the silence meant. The hunger had broken. It had broken the way certain fevers break, with a clarity on the far side of it that is its own kind of violence, because it does not come with amnesia, because it leaves you fully present in the wreckage of what the fever did while you were lost in it. The clarity had shown him the village. The clarity had shown him the morning light on everything. He had stood in the snow, in the cleared center of the village, and he had understood, and the understanding had been the thing he had carried out of it, the thing he still carried, the heaviest thing he had ever carried, and it did not get lighter. 3 years old is what he was, young enough to still feel the weight of new things. He thought about the survivor. He had not thought consciously about the survivor in a long time, had kept this particular recollection in a sealed category, a room in the architecture of his memory that he did not enter because there was nothing in it that served the ongoing operation of his existence. He had known, even in the morning light of the day after, that he had not been the only thing to walk away from the village. He had known it from the signs and from the silence itself, which had a quality different from the complete silence of total devastation, a quality that contained within it the acoustic trace of one last living thing, one last set of movements through the wreckage, one last departure before the cold had finished with everything that remained. Something had survived. He had known it and had understood what the surviving meant, that among all the people of the village, one had been left alive or had been made into something other than dead, which was not the same as alive. He had not pursued it. He had not been capable of pursuing it. He had barely been capable of standing. And by the time he had recovered enough to be capable of anything, the trail had gone cold in the literal winter sense, and he had told himself, the first significant lie he had told himself, though not the last, that the survival could have been innocent, that what he had sensed could have been misconstrued, that perhaps one villager had been elsewhere that night, had returned in the morning to find the wreckage and fled, and was now simply a traumatized survivor somewhere in the East. He had known this was not true. He had known it with the certainty that he applied to all the information that his senses provided him, and his senses did not make this kind of error. But knowing it was not true had been entirely compatible with deciding not to act on the knowledge, and he had exercised that compatibility with the thoroughness of a young thing in terrible pain, making the only choice that allowed it to continue moving. He had gone west. He had put hundreds of miles between himself and the village. He had begun the long process of becoming what he was now. He had not gone back. He had not gone back. The east was dark ahead of him, and the rain's margin was cold against his face. And the trail was there, consistent and clear and growing stronger, and the shape in the moss at the base of the well was there too, in his memory, where it would remain with perfect fidelity forever. He walked through it. He walked east. He told himself that he did not yet know what he knew, because knowing it would require a reorganization of the entire framework of this hunt that he was not prepared to perform until he had confirmed it, until the confirmation was undeniable, until there was no space remaining for the possibility that he was wrong. He was not wrong. He had not been wrong about anything his senses told him in a very long time. He walked east and the dark held everything it had always held, and the trail was ahead of him, and the night was long, and he was very, very old, and none of this was new, and all of it was unbearable. The structure had been a monastery, at some point in the distant past, not distant by ordinary historical measure, but sufficiently prior to the present that the intervening centuries had reduced it to something that required an informed reading to identify as having been deliberately built. The stones were still there, and some of the walls, and the general organizational principle of the space was legible if you knew what you were looking for. The east-west axis of the church, the remains of the cloister garth, the outline of the chapter house. Time and weather and the organized stripping of useful material by subsequent generations had done the rest. What remained was the skeleton of a place, the structural bones without the flesh of habitation, open to the sky in most of its sections, insulated only by the remaining height of the outer walls, which varied from nearly intact to rubble. He had spent 2 hours outside it before entering. The perimeter approach was not caution in the conventional sense. He was not afraid of ambush, was not particularly concerned about the creature inside, having prepared some mechanism of attack that would neutralize his approach. He was something much older and more powerful than what was inside, and he knew this. And the knowing of it was not arrogance, but simple operational awareness of the relevant parameters. He had spent the 2 hours outside because he needed them. He needed to do something with the knowledge he was now carrying, the confirmed knowledge, the knowledge that the confirmation of the trail and the specific quality of what he was sensing from inside the ruins had made undeniable. He needed to do something with it that would not compromise his ability to do what he had come here to do. He did not know if he could. This was new. He had walked into more than 60 confrontations of this kind and had never, prior to this one, experienced uncertainty about his ability to complete the act. He had experienced uncertainty about his right to complete the act. That was a constant, a fixed companion to the work, the unresolvable moral question that he had decided to remain open rather than to close by false resolution. But the capacity had never been uncertain. The will had never wavered. He had been, in each prior instance, whatever the situation required him to be, without hesitation, because the thing he was going to do was remove from the world a creature that was actively and continuing to harm the living. And regardless of his own moral status, this was a concrete reduction in concrete harm that his continued operation permitted. Now he stood outside a ruined monastery in the rain's forward margin, in the dark, with the scent of what was inside reaching him with perfect clarity. And he understood that the thing he was going to do to complete this hunt was not the same as what he had done in the 60 prior instances. He understood it in full, with no mitigating ambiguity, because the clarity that had been forced on him by the shape in the moss, and the quality of the trail, and the unmistakable specific signature of the thing inside was now complete and irrevocable. He was going to kill something that would not have existed if he had not existed. He was going to kill something that had not asked to be what it was, that had not volunteered for the circumstances that had made it what it was, that had been shaped by something done to it, something done to it by him, and that had then made its way through the subsequent years into this ruined monastery and this particular terrible form of being. The child from the village, not a child anymore, had not been a child for a very long time. He did not know how old it was precisely, could not fully read the age from the signature. His own involvement in its origin complicated the reading, added a harmonic to the signal that confused the dating the way a fundamental note confuses the identification of an overtone. He knew it was very old, that the decades he had estimated initially were insufficient, that the signature carried more weight than decades explained. He had been, in his initial estimation, wrong in the direction that served him better. The creature inside was older than it should have been, older than he had assigned it, and that was the last lie he had told himself about this hunt, the last small mercy he had granted himself before the confirmation made mercy impossible. He had seen survivors before. He had encountered, across the centuries, perhaps a dozen people who had survived an attack by a newly made vampire and been turned in the process, who had woken into the condition rather than dying of it. His own turning had not been by attack. He did not think about his own origin, kept it in the same sealed category as the village, attended to it only when operational necessity required. But he understood the turning by violence, understood what it produced in terms of psychological foundation. You woke into awareness in the wreckage of your prior life. You woke into the understanding of what you were in the precise location where you had lost what you had been. Your first consciousness of your new nature was inseparable from the devastation that had produced it. And the devastation had a perpetrator, a specific identifiable cause, something that had moved through your world with overwhelming force and unmade everything you knew and then departed. He had departed. He had left behind something that was not alive and not dead, that had woken into ruins and been forced to construct its existence from the materials available in ruins, with no guide and no community and no understanding of what it was or what it could become. He had been made at least by something that had remained, something that had stayed for a time, had tried in the stumbling early way to provide some orientation. This creature had been made and then abandoned in the ashes of its origin, and the ashes had been its education, and the education had been his responsibility, and the creature it had produced was here, inside these ruins, waiting with a patience that was itself a form of testimony. He entered through the gap in the outer wall where the gate had once stood. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. The roofless sections open to the sky and cold, the remaining covered portions deeply dark. The spaces between walls filled with the accumulated debris of centuries, fallen stone, the ruins of wooden structures that had long since composted into the earth, tangles of growth that had advanced through cracks in the flagstones and spread across what had been an interior garden. The rain began lightly as he moved through the cloister garth, and the sound of it on the remaining stone roofing was very specific, a regular small percussion that filled the covered spaces with a texture of sound that made the silence of the uncovered spaces more profound by contrast. He could feel it, could feel the specific location of it within the structure, could feel that it was aware of him, had been aware of him for longer than his 2 hours outside, had likely been aware of him for days, had known he was coming, had arranged itself here not despite knowing he was coming, but because of it. The invitational quality of the position was confirmed now. Whatever was going to happen in the next portion of this night had been anticipated, prepared for, perhaps orchestrated, with the patience that very old things have for the arrangements they consider important. He moved toward the chapter house. The chapter house was where the remaining roofing was most intact, where the darkness was deepest, where something that preferred enclosed spaces would have found the most suitable portion of the ruin. The door arch remained standing without a door, the stone lintel carved with letters in a script so worn by weather that they were beyond reading, though he could feel the ghost of their original precision in the stone, the intention of them, the artistry that had gone into a threshold meant to frame an entrance to a sacred space. He passed under them and stood in the chapter house and let his eyes adjust to the darkness, which did not require long. It was against the far wall. He had prepared himself for many things. He had spent the 2 hours outside constructing the encounter with all the rigor of long experience, running through the variables, anticipating configurations, preparing the internal landscape for the emotional impact of whatever confirmation awaited him. He had done this with great thoroughness. It had not been adequate preparation. What was against the far wall was old. Old in the way that the oldest things he had ever encountered were old, wearing the age visibly, carrying it in the density of its presence, the way that stones carry the pressure of the formations above them, compressed and concentrated and undeniable. It was not the age he had miscalculated. It was not the age he had underestimated, because the age alone he could have held without reorganizing anything. It was the face. He had not expected to recognize the face. He had prepared himself for a monster, for the features of monstrosity, for whatever the centuries of violence and the specific formation of this particular existence had done to a face. He had not prepared himself for recognition, for the remaining legibility of what had been there before the centuries, for the specific arrangement of features that persisted through everything that had been done to them and everything that had been done by them, that remained somehow identifiable against all probability as a particular person, a particular child, from a particular village in a particular winter. He stood very still. The creature against the wall was also still. It had a stillness that matched his own, the stillness of very old things that have learned to conserve the energy of movement, because they understand that energy is all there is, that entropy is the only truly universal force, that everything that moves is diminishing toward a final stillness that is indistinguishable from the stillness before. It looked at him with eyes that had been looking at him, he understood now, for a very long time. Not the days of this approach, longer than that. In the way that things can look at something across impossible distances of time, with a focused attention that survives the distances because nothing else has absorbed it, because the attention has nowhere else to go. There was no fear in the face. He had expected to find fear, or rage, or the specific blank depthlessness that characterized the most ancient and the most damaged of his kind. He found none of these things. He found recognition, which was worse than any of them. The recognition was the worst thing, because it meant that the creature against the wall knew exactly what he was, knew exactly what he had been on the night that had made it what it was, and had maintained a perfect and complete account of this, in the way that his kind maintained accounts, with no mercy of forgetting, no kindness of distance. It had carried him, specifically, with the completeness that his own memory carried the village, as a total and unrevisable presence, the origin point of everything, the foundation of its entire existence. He was the thing it had been made from, the foundational violence in its life, the architect of everything it had become. And it had been waiting. Not for rescue. It was far too old and too formed for that kind of waiting. Not for confrontation in the physical sense. The physical confrontation, it had clearly understood, was possible and had prepared for, but the preparation was not the point of the waiting. It had been waiting for him to be here. It had been waiting for him to stand in this room and look at this face and understand exactly what he was looking at. It had been waiting for a witness. The body arrangements in the towns, he understood now, had never been about the victims at all. They had been messages to him specifically, a set of escalating signals designed to ensure that he would follow the trail here, to this room, to this specific encounter. He had been maneuvered, with great patience and great intelligence, by something that knew his methods and his responses, and his particular form of attention, because something that had been shaped by him would know these things, would have studied them from a great distance, across a great many years, preparing for exactly this. The creature had not been created by him in any simple sense. It had been created by the night of the village, by the violence of that night and the abandonment that followed it, and it had then spent its existence constructing itself from those materials, building itself into what it was now. And what it was now was something that had deliberately produced a trail that would lead only to him, that had committed its recent violence with a methodology that mirrored his own original violence, closely enough to constitute a specific reference, a deliberate echo, a statement. He was the statement's intended audience. He was, he understood, the only audience it had ever had. The only witness who could fully understand what was being witnessed. The only consciousness in the world that carried the necessary context to read what was being presented. There was no one else who had been in the village. There was no one else alive who had any knowledge of what had happened that winter or any relationship to its consequences. There was just the two of them in this chapter house, in the rain, and everything between them was singular and unshared and more than a century old. He stood in the door arch and did not move toward it. He was not ready. He recognized this with the kind of clear-eyed internal accounting that he had always applied to himself, not operational. He was something else, something that was not well named by any term he had, something that was composed of guilt and grief, and the specific devastation of being seen completely by the one entity whose seeing of him he had never prepared for, whose recognition of him he had, in the deepest layers of his operational self-management, always feared. The creature against the wall waited. The rain fell on the stone. He understood in the silence what the creature had done to earn the right to this moment. Not in any moral sense. He was not applying a moral framework to what had been done across the valleys and the towns, was not attempting to balance the villages against anything. He meant something different by the word right. He meant that the creature had paid for this confrontation in the currency of everything it was, had organized its entire existence, for however long its existence had been, around the production of this specific encounter, had oriented its considerable intelligence and patience, and the long centuries of its particular form of being toward a single terminal act, which was this, to make him stand here and see it, to make him look at what he had made. This was not justice. He had no illusions about justice. Justice was a framework that required a functioning social order, a consensual agreement about what was owed, an external arbitration that neither of them could access and neither of them had ever accessed. This was something older than justice and more elemental, something that did not need a framework because it did not require mediation. It was simply confrontation. The origin facing the consequence, the act facing its aftermath. The century-long gap between them closed in a ruined chapter house in the rain, closed by the will of the one who had been abandoned, who had made the closing of it the entire structure of an existence. He looked at the face for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at everything important, completely, without flinching, without the protective distancing that even his discipline could not always prevent. He looked at it and found what he had been afraid of finding. Not a monster, though the monster was there too. What he found beneath the monster was the residue of the child, the specific human formation that had been in place before the village's winter, that had survived the transformation and the centuries, not as a living presence, but as a ghost within the architectural structure of what the creature had become. The way a ghost of a building can persist in the land beneath a new building. The old foundation showing through when the surface is disturbed. The residue of the child did not make this easier. He had not expected it to. He had perhaps in the inaccessible depths of the self he did not examine closely, hoped that what he would find here would be so completely transformed by the centuries as to be unrecognizable, that the child would be entirely gone, that what remained would be purely monster, that the act he needed to perform would be uncomplicated by the specific personal history that complicated it. He had hoped this, and he had known the hope was false, and he had maintained it anyway, because even very old things maintain false hopes when the alternative is confronting what the hope is protecting them from. There was no protection here. He was fully exposed to what he was looking at, fully present to it, and what he was fully present to was the direct consequence of the worst thing he had ever done. Standing against a wall in a ruined monastery and looking at him with eyes that knew everything. He thought about all the things he had told himself in the centuries since the village. The gradual construction of purpose. The careful architecture of the hunting, built specifically so that it would serve as something against the memory of the village. Not as balance, but as something to do with himself. Some structure to impose on the chaos of his own continued existence. He thought about the 60-plus instances of the hunting, each one a complete act with its own weight and its own specific moral accounting, each one a reduction of harm that had objective value regardless of his motivation for performing it. He thought about the operational framework he had built, the discipline, the methodical approach, the willingness to keep the central moral question of his own status permanently open. He thought about all of it. He thought about the village. He thought about the morning light, the snow, the specific quality of the silence, the particular arrangement of the world in that cold illumination after. He thought about the moment he had understood and the understanding, and what the understanding had felt like when it was new, and what it felt like now after the centuries had compressed it into something that was not old either, was just permanent, was simply a feature of the landscape of his interior life, the way certain geographical features are permanent features of physical landscape, present at every angle, visible from every direction, unable to be placed behind him because he carried them with him everywhere. He thought about the child running. He allowed himself this much, this single image, this single admission. The child, in the chaos of that night, running. Running because children run, because the body's response to overwhelming force is to flee, because the legs do not consult the mind in these moments, and the mind does not consult the will, and what is left is the pure animal impulse toward survival, the same impulse that emptied the woods of birds, running through the village, running through the snow, running east eventually, because east was a way. East was the direction that the landscape permitted escape. East was the ridge and the dark on the other side of it. Running east, he had also gone east. He had taken decades longer to arrive. The creature against the wall made a sound then. Not a word. There were no words between them, would never be words between them, because words required a common framework that did not exist here and could not be built, because what was between them predated any framework that language could describe. It made a sound that was not language and not animal. A sound that came from somewhere in the accumulated architecture of the centuries, somewhere beneath the monster and beneath the residue of the child. From something that had no name, because nothing had ever been this thing before, and language only names what has existed long enough to require a name. He heard it. He heard it with the completeness that his senses brought to everything, and the completeness of the hearing was he understood. The last thing that was required of him before what came next. He moved. He did not approach. He arrived. The distinction mattered because approach implies a traversal of space that takes a duration. And what he did in that room did not take a duration in any sense that ordinary physics would sanction. He moved from the door arch to the far wall in a way that would have been invisible to any human observer. That would have been a blur even to most non-human observers. That was purely a function of what he was at his oldest and most refined. The accumulated physical capability of centuries, maintained by discipline and feeding, and the specific quality of age that made the very old things of his kind faster and stronger. Not incrementally, but categorically, in the way that certain increases of scale produce qualitative rather than merely quantitative change. The creature received him the same way, with arrival rather than approach. What happened in the chapter house was not a fight in any sense that the word carries in ordinary usage. A fight implies opposition, implies that the parties engaged in it are oriented toward an outcome that one of them will achieve and the other will not. What happened was more like a convergence of histories, two ancient things in a very old space, applying to each other the full weight of everything they had been and become. The stone walls received the impact of it in the way that stone receives everything, with a patience that outlasts all of what is brought against it, taking the damage into itself, incorporating it. He was stronger. This was not in question. Whatever the creature had become across its centuries, whatever the specific formation of its power, and it was considerable. It was more than he had encountered in any prior hunt. He registered this immediately in the first contact. It was not equivalent to what he was. He was older, and the age was the thing that mattered most, because age in their kind was not simply duration but transformation, the slow conversion of everything excess into something fundamental, the gradual approach to a form that was less like a living thing and more like a force with a living form. And he was further along this conversion than anything he had ever hunted. He was stronger. But strength was not what this was about, and they both knew it. The creature fought with every capability it had, which was considerable. The chapter house became a space of controlled catastrophe. Stone struck and cracked, the remaining roof tiles dislodging and falling. The accumulated debris of centuries thrown against the walls by the concussive force of two ancient things fully applying themselves. He took damage. The creature's strength was sufficient for that, was sufficient to find the gaps in what he was and press into them with a focused precision that told him something about the intelligence that had developed it, the specific study of what he was that the creature had conducted across the long distance of the years, the preparation that had produced not just this confrontation, but this specific strategy, this targeted attack on the specific vulnerabilities that only something that knew him intimately could have identified. Something that had been made from him. Something that had studied the maker, the way children study parents, with the comprehensive intensity of those whose entire world is organized by the one who formed it. He bled. He had not bled in a long time. The sensation of it was remarkable, not in a painful sense, because pain was not what he experienced from damage, but in a profound sense, in the sense of a reminder. He bled, and the blood was dark and fell on the stone flagging of the chapter house floor, and the smell of it was the smell of everything he was and had been, and the smell rose in the close air of the enclosed space, and he breathed it, and it was terrible and familiar. The creature was bleeding too, more than him. He was stronger. The violence was not savage in the way that the word savage usually operates. It was not frenzied. It was not out of control. It was precise and committed on both sides, a precision that came from great capability brought to bear without restraint but with direction. He did not fight with rage, had not fought with rage since the early centuries when rage was still available to him as a resource. He fought with the cold clarity of long purpose meeting long purpose, with the specific application of everything he was to the specific problem in front of him. And the creature fought with something that was not rage either. It fought with the focused commitment of an act being completed, of a long intention reaching its terminal point, of something that had been in preparation for a very long time finally being performed. He thought in the midst of it about how it felt to be hit by something that he had made. Not literally. He had not created this creature with any of the deliberateness that creation implies. But in the sense that was real, the creature had been made from the matter of his act, had been constituted by what he had done, had been formed from the raw material of his violence and his abandonment, and the specific qualities of his failure. Being hit by, it was being hit by what he had produced. The impact carried his own origin back to him through the body of its consequence. He wondered if this was what the creature had intended. He thought it was. He thought the entire arc of the confrontation had been designed to produce exactly this: the physical experience of reciprocity, the specific sensation of receiving from what you had made, the symmetry of it enacted in the most direct and inescapable medium available, which was the body. There were no words for this. There had never needed to be words for it. The end came not from a moment of climactic overcoming, but from the gradual assertion of the differential. He was stronger and stronger, sustained and maintained over the duration, eventually resolved the question that capability makes of capability. The creature against him was extraordinary. He had not encountered anything close to it in all his prior hunts, but extraordinary was not enough against what he was. He was the final form of a very long process, and the final form of a very long process is not overcome by something younger, however gifted, however precisely targeted the attack. The creature was on the stone floor of the chapter house. He was above it. The rain was very present now, coming through the gaps in the remaining roof in thin streams, finding the low points of the flagging and collecting in shallow moving sheets that caught what little light entered through the broken walls. The sound of it was everywhere. The smell of blood was everywhere. His own and the creature's, indistinguishable by category, distinguishable only by the specific signature of each. And the signatures were related, were harmonically related, were the signatures of the origin and what the origin had made, different in the way that the song and its echo are different, the same in the way that the song and its echo are the same. He looked at the face. He looked at it for a long time. The creature looked back. The recognition was still there, undiminished, undimmed by the violence or by the position or by what was about to happen. If anything, the recognition had increased. It had been waiting, he understood, for this moment specifically, for the moment of being seen completely in the moment of ending, for the moment when there would be no more distance, no more centuries of separation, no more cold geography between the origin and its consequence. Just this, the two of them, finally, at the exact distance of nothing. He lowered himself, not over the creature, beside it. Beside it, in the rain and the blood on the stone. And this was wrong. This broke every operational principle he had developed across the long history of the hunt. And he knew this, and he did not correct it. He had never been beside one of them at the end. He had never permitted proximity at the end, had always maintained the formal distance of function from function, of work from what the work was. He had maintained this for reasons that he recognized now, in the clear cold light of the chapter house, as having been primarily protective, protecting himself from the specific experience that he was having now, which was the experience of being present, fully and without mitigation, to the death of something whose existence he had caused. He had caused 60+ deaths. He had never been present for them in this way. He had performed them with the clean efficiency of someone performing a necessary act and moved on, maintaining the operational framework that kept the necessary act from contaminating the person performing it. He had thought, for many centuries, that this was discipline. He understood now that it was a form of the self-deception he had forsworn, a way of remaining at the functional distance from what he did that kept him from having to inhabit it completely. He inhabited it now. He had not meant to feed. He had not planned it and had not anticipated it, and in the years and decades of the hunt had never once fed at the scene, had always carried the feeding away from the act itself, maintaining a categorical separation between the two that was part of the structure he had built for himself, that gave the feeding a quality different from what it would have had if he had simply fed from every creature he destroyed. The separation was, he had always believed, the difference between predation and purpose. The feeding was a biological necessity. The hunting was something other than that. Conflating them was the path towards something he did not want to become. He fed. He fed because the creature was dying, and he was beside it, and the smell of what was dying was the smell of his own kind, the specific intimate smell that existed below all other smells, and the hunger, which was always there, which was the most constant thing in his existence. The hunger did not consult his intentions or his frameworks or his carefully maintained operational architecture. It was simply present, as it was always present, and the thing between them was more specific than the biological, was not simply appetite finding opportunity, was something that he had no prior language for, and that he could not locate within any of his existing categories. He grieved. He did not know if grief was the right word. He had grieved before, across the centuries, in the way that very old things grieve. Slowly, thoroughly, without the temporal boundaries that human grief observes. Grief that does not end, but modulates. That does not resolve, but transforms into something you carry differently than you carried it initially. He had grieved the village for centuries, had grieved it in the specific way that guilt and grief become indistinguishable over sufficient time, had grieved every face he could still see, and every face he could no longer see clearly, and the shape of the village in winter before that winter, and everything that had been there before he arrived. He knew grief very well. What he did now at the end of the creature in the rain in the chapter house in the ruined monastery was grief, but it was also something that grief alone could not fully describe. It was the grief of the act and the grief of its consequence and the grief of the impossibility of any resolution. The grief of being the kind of thing that produces consequences it cannot undo and that continue after the act in ways the act cannot anticipate. The grief of being old and powerful and entirely incapable of the one thing that would have mattered, which was not to have done it in the first place, which was to have been in the village that winter and done nothing, which was to have been not existed. He could not have not existed. He existed. He had existed through the village and through everything after the village, and he was existing now in this chapter house with this consequence, and the consequence was ending, and he was the reason it had existed and would end, and there was no framework that made this anything other than what it was. He drank. The blood of his own kind tasted different from the blood of ordinary predators, had always tasted different. But this blood was different in a way that went further, in a way that his kind's blood did not ordinarily go. This blood tasted like origin, like the original thing, like the specific quality of the worst night of his long existence, preserved in the blood with the perfect fidelity of something that had never been allowed to diminish or transform, that had been held at origin pitch for the entire duration, because holding it at origin pitch was the creature's project, the creature's occupation, the creature's reason for continuing to be. Everything it had done and everything it had become, and all the violence and all the waiting and all the patient devastating work of the body arrangements in the towns, and the circle at the well and the closed church doors and the long trail east, all of it was in the blood at the end, the complete account, and he drank the complete account, and it was the worst thing he had ever tasted, and he drank all of it. After, he sat on the flagging of the chapter house floor in the rain and the blood and the dark. The rain was heavier now, the forward edge of the storm having advanced past his location, so that he was no longer in the margin but in the full body of the weather, and the water came through the gaps in the roof in sheets rather than streams, and ran across the floor and found the creature's blood and carried it toward the low corner where the flagging had settled and subsided over the centuries, and the blood ran in the water in a shape that was not deliberate and not symbolic and was simply what water does with what it finds. He sat. He was not capable immediately of anything else. This was new. He had always been capable, immediately after, of continuation, had always been able to stand and assess and move on, to leave the scene and the act behind, to carry the operational discipline through the end of the act and into the resumption of normal movement. He had thought, if he thought about it, that this was the product of discipline, the evidence that the discipline was working, that the internal architecture he had built was sufficient to its purpose. He understood now that it had been the product of distance. The distance had permitted continuation. Proximity did not. He sat in the water and the blood and the rain, and he let himself be fully present to what had happened. And what had happened was everything. Was the village and the morning light and the running child and the decades of East and the body arrangements and the shape in the moss and the recognition in the face and the grief feeding and the complete account in the blood. All of it at once, held simultaneously in the permanent comprehensive memory that was the most demanding quality of what he was, held without any of the mechanisms of protection or distance that he had developed across the centuries to make the holding bearable. It was not bearable. He bore it. He was still there when the sky began to change. Not dawn yet, the change that precedes dawn, the subtle atmospheric shift that occurs perhaps an hour before the first light, when the absolute dark begins to modulate towards something less absolute, when the quality of the darkness changes not in its depth but in its texture, when the air itself seems to carry something different, some advance information about what is coming. He knew this change well. He had spent many centuries being attuned to it, had developed the awareness of it with the care that any creature develops an awareness that constitutes the primary practical boundary of its existence. Dawn was not abstract for him. He knew it with the intimacy of long experience, knew the precise interval between the first atmospheric change and the first actual light that would matter, knew the rate of progression, knew how long he had once the progression began. He had never miscalculated it. He had never been in an unsafe position at first light. He was too old and too careful for this kind of error. He sat in the water and the blood, and he noticed the change, and he did not move. He did not move because he was still holding everything, still fully present to it, still refusing to allow the protection of distance to reassert itself prematurely, still insisting on being in this room, in this night with what had happened in this room, in this night. He was not suicidal. He knew the difference between not moving immediately and not moving at all, knew the difference between staying present to what had happened and stepping into the sun, was not confused about this. He was simply not ready to resume. He was not ready to stand up and walk out of the chapter house and leave what had happened here behind him in the way that he had always left the acts of the hunt behind him. He had not been present for any of the others. He had been operationally present, had completed the acts with full attentiveness and capability, but he had not been there in the way that made what happened accumulate in him, had not been vulnerable to it, had not allowed it to reach through the operational distance to the thing underneath the operation. This one had reached through. This one would not be left behind in the chapter house the way the others had been left in their locations, would not recede into the catalog of completed work, would not become simply another instance in a long series. This one was different for the obvious reason, which was the obvious reason he had resisted knowing for as long as he had been able to resist knowing it. This one was him. Not metaphorically, actually, in the most direct and unambiguous sense available. The creature he had killed had been made from him, had been constituted by him, had been the product of his worst act and his greatest failure and his most permanent responsibility. And he had killed it and fed from it, and the account of everything it had been was now in him, carried in his blood alongside everything else he carried, permanent and unlosable. He finally stood. He stood slowly, which was not his natural speed of movement, but deliberate slowness felt correct for what he was doing, felt like the appropriate pace for leaving this specific room on this specific morning. He looked at the floor for a moment. at the water carrying the blood toward the low corner, at the marks the night had left on the stones. He had left marks too, he realized. The deep impressions of the confrontation were in the walls, in the cracked flagging, in the places where the roof had finally given way completely over one corner, and the stone had come down. The chapter house was more destroyed than it had been. He had done this, along with everything else he had done in this place. He turned and walked to the door arch. He paused there, at the threshold, between the chapter house and the cloister garth. The carved letters above him were still unreadable, worn beyond recovery, but he put his hand on the stone of the lintel for a moment, not in any ceremonial way, not in a way that was attempting to mean something beyond what it was, simply because the stone was there, and it was very old, and he was very old, and it seemed for a moment to be enough to touch a thing that had been here this long. The stone was cold. It was extraordinarily cold, the deep cold of material that has not been warm for centuries, and the cold of it against his hand felt like something, though he could not have said what. He removed his hand and walked into the cloister garth. The rain had reduced to something lighter, a fine consistent moisture rather than the full-body precipitation of the storm's center. The sky above the open garth was beginning to show what preceded the change he had already sensed, the first, faintest suggestion of differentiation between sky and clouds, between the darkness and the more specific darkness, a quality of imminence in the east. He stood in the garth with the light moisture on his face and looked east, as he had been looking east for 11 days, and he thought about east. East was where things went when they ran. East was where the child had gone. East was where the trail had led, and the trail was finished now. The trail ended here. And east was now simply the direction toward which he would continue to move, as he had always continued to move, as he would continue to move for whatever duration remained, which was, by any reasonable accounting of his kind, a very long duration. He thought about what it meant to continue. He had thought about this before, many times, in many different configurations and with many different framings, and he had never arrived at an answer that was fully satisfying, and he had long ago stopped expecting a satisfying answer. Continuing was not about meaning, not about resolution, not about the completion of any arc that would provide the perspective of distance on what had been done. Continuing was simpler than that and harder than that. Continuing was just continuing. Getting up from the floor of the chapter house and walking into the garth and looking east. Letting the mission resume, because the mission was real regardless of what the person performing it was, because the things it addressed were real and ongoing and indifferent to the internal condition of the one who addressed them. There were more of them. He knew this without needing confirmation, knew it the way he knew everything he knew, through the comprehensive reading of the world he performed simply by existing in it. There were more creatures in the dark that were doing what creatures in the dark do, and some of them were doing it with a breadth of damage that required addressing, and he was the thing that addressed it, and this was true regardless of what had happened in the chapter house tonight. The world did not pause its requirements while he processed what had happened. The requirements were indifferent to process. They existed, and he existed, and between these two facts there was a relationship that did not depend on his readiness, or the completeness or the resolution of anything internal to him. He thought about all the towns, not the ones in this hunt, the towns across the entirety of his existence, across the entirety of the long centuries of the hunting. He thought about the people in them, the specific people, the ones who had not known that something had passed through their region and been removed before it reached them, who had not known there was anything to know, who had gone about their seasons and their years and their generations without any awareness of the particular architecture of their safety, which was him. He thought about them without sentiment, without the romanticizing of his own role, without the self-serving narrative that would transform the thought into something that absolved him of anything. He thought about them as they were, people living their lives, unaware, not requiring his awareness to live them. He thought about the village. He would always think about the village. The village was the floor of everything, the foundation on which all subsequent thought about all subsequent things stood. the ground that was always there beneath whatever was above it. He did not try to put the village behind him. He had stopped trying very early, when the trying had been revealed as both futile and dishonest. The village was in him, as the account was now in him, as everything he had taken and done and been, and survived across the long centuries was in him. And what he was now was the sum of everything that had gone into him. And the sum was walking east in the early not quite dawn, in the rain's aftermath, in the cold air coming off the mountains ahead. He passed through the gap in the outer wall where the gate had once stood. The road east was pale in the early light that was beginning, barely beginning, the first suggestion rather than the first fact, and the road was empty, and the forest on either side of it was silent in the specific way it had been silent since before he arrived. The birds still gone, the small animals still deep in their burrows, the particular ecological withdrawal that his presence caused still in effect, would be in effect for some time after he moved on, the radius of disturbance trailing him like a shadow cast in all directions rather than one. He had always been a thing that caused withdrawal. He had accepted this in the early centuries and had stopped accepting it in the middle centuries and had accepted it again in the later centuries, and was simply aware of it now without the layer of judgment that accepting or not accepting required. He was what he was. The forest knew it, in the way that the deepest mechanisms of living things knew what was not compatible with them, what carried a frequency too old and too final to coexist with the ordinary frequencies of living. He moved through the forest's withdrawal, and the forest closed behind him, and ahead of him, the road went east, and the sky was very slowly becoming something other than dark. He would not die today. He was not walking east toward death, was not choosing the dawn as a terminal act, was not performing the poetic gesture of the creature that has finished its purpose walking into the light that would unmake it. He had considered this briefly on the floor of the chapter house, in the full weight of what he was holding. He had considered it and found it dishonest, found the appeal of it to be primarily the appeal of an ending, of a resolution, of the clean final period after the long complicated sentence. He was not entitled to a clean final period. The dead of the village were not available for periods. The creature that had been made from their night was not available for periods. He was not entitled to one either. He would continue. He would continue because the next town was out there somewhere to the east or the north or the south. And in the next town, there was a trail beginning or ending or in progress. And he would read it with the comprehensive senses that centuries had refined, and he would follow it with the discipline that had replaced every other organizing principle of his existence. And he would do what he did because it was what he was, and what he was had not changed and would not change, not fundamentally, not at the level of what he owed. The sky was definitely lighter now, not light, lighter. The distinction was precise and important. There was a difference between a thing beginning to change and a thing having changed, and what he was walking in was the beginning of the change, the earliest stage of the transition from one condition to another, the margin again, the uncertain space between states that he had been traveling in for 11 days ahead of the storm, and was now traveling in again ahead of the dawn. He moved through it without hurry, without urgency, without the particular quality of haste that he had moved through these transitions in the early centuries when the transitions had felt more threatening. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the long patience of something that has been moving for a very long time and understands that the moving is the thing, that there is no destination that resolves the moving into a final position, that the goal is not arrival but the quality of the movement itself, whether the movement is honest and purposeful and attended by the correct understanding of what it costs. It cost everything, always. He had always known this. He knew it with more specificity now. He walked east. There is a quality that old hunters have, the ones who have been at it long enough, that distinguishes them from those who are new to the work. It is not wisdom exactly, though it includes wisdom. It is not confidence, though it is sometimes confused with confidence by those who observe it from outside. It is something closer to gravity, the quality of a thing that has significant mass and moves, with the steady inevitability of mass in motion, that cannot be easily stopped or redirected because it is not moving toward a specific target, but in a specific direction, and directions continue beyond any individual target. He moved with this quality through the remaining dark, through the forest's withdrawal, through the cold air and the aftermath of rain, through the specific silence of a place that something old had recently passed through. He moved without hurry and without hesitation, and without the internal noise that had occupied him for 11 days, the vertigo of recognition, the escalating weight of what he had been refusing to acknowledge, the structural anxiety of a hunter who has begun to understand what he is actually hunting. That noise had been resolved by the chapter house. Not into silence, resolved into something else, something denser and more permanent, something that had joined the floor of the village and the morning light and the complete account in the blood, all of it now part of the substrate on which he moved. The world he moved through was not safer for what he had done in the chapter house. He understood this very clearly and had always understood it, though the understanding bore repeating in the aftermath of a hunt that had felt incorrectly, like it might be different, like it might resolve into something that ordinary resolutions could describe. The world was not safer. The world was what it had always been, the dark full of things that moved in it, some of them living and some of them not living and not dead, and among the not living and not dead, some of them manageable and some of them not, and among the manageable ones some of them already doing damage, and some of them in the process of beginning to do damage. And all of this ongoing and continuous and indifferent to what he had done in any particular chapter house on any particular night. There would always be another trail. He had come to terms with this, in the centuries-long process of coming to terms with everything. And the coming to terms had not produced acceptance in the comfortable sense, but had produced something he could work with, which was the understanding that the work did not end and was not meant to end, and the value of the work was not contingent on its ending. He moved through the world, and the world produced what the world produced, and some of what the world produced required his attention, and he gave his attention, and this was not heroism, and not redemption, and not justice. It was simply the specific use of what he was. There were things being done right now in the dark that were not being done by anything that could address them. There were things happening at the margins of human settlement, at the edge of lit windows, just beyond the warmth of fires, in the spaces between the places where people felt safe, that ordinary human courage and ordinary human understanding were not equipped to address, not because those things were insufficient, but because the world contained things that operated outside the category of ordinary. This had always been true. It would continue to be true after him, would be true in the absence of anything like him, would be true in any world that was sufficiently complex to generate the range of possibilities that complexity generates. He was one thing that addressed a particular category of the range. He was very old and very effective, and he carried everything he carried, and he did the work that he did. And the morning light would come in an hour, and he would be underground before it arrived. And tomorrow night he would be moving again, and the night after that, and the year after that, and the decade after that, and he would be carrying the chapter house then as he had carried the village, as he had always carried everything, because what he was did not put things down. Monsters do not hunt each other in a world that becomes safer for the hunting. They hunt each other in a world that continues, that proceeds through its darkness without end, that generates its own shadows in the process of generating its own light. The hunting does not purify the world. It does not repair the original damage. It does not balance any ledger or conclude any sentence or bring any history to its appropriate resolution. The dead remain dead. The made remain made. The consequences remain consequences. The hunter remains what the hunter is, which is one more thing in the dark among the things in the dark, distinguished only by its direction, moving toward what moves away, attending to what prefers not to be attended to, carrying forward through the cold morning the weight of everything it has done and everything that has been done to it, and everything that has been done in its name, and the names of all the other things it has been, across all the long centuries of this particular darkness. He moved east. The light was coming. He would be beneath the ground before it arrived. He would be moving again tomorrow. This was what he was. This was what he would always be.